Welcome back everyone to today's class again. Another lecture series on CVPA. According to what I said, in this class, we'll be looking at the formulas of CVPA, which we have already expounded one in our previous class on how to compute BEP in units. So, we'll be looking at how do we compute BEP in Naira. The examiner at times wants you to compute BEP, the break-even point, as expressed in monetary value or in sales value. So, how do you go about that in an exam condition? It's a very simple question or directive. The only thing you need to know is to be attentive to this professional classroom organized by Lensity. BEP in Naira. What's the formula? To get your break-even point, the point at which no loss, no gain in Naira. What you do need to do is you need to modify the formula. Don't forget that formula for BEP in unit is fixed cost over contribution per unit, or what we call contribution margin per unit, CMU. If you are going to compute it in Naira, there's going to be a modification or it changes. And what's the change about? It's just a slight change. It will now be fixed cost over contribution margin ratio, CMR. It seems strange. What's contribution margin ratio? That will be the next question in your mind there. There's nothing special about it. Just as we compute contribution per unit, or what we refer to as CPU. Sorry, we are not talking about computer. I meant contribution per unit, not CPU, central processing unit. So, to get a contribution margin ratio, actually what you need to do is you take the contribution per unit, divide it by the selling price per unit. That gives you the selling price, the contribution margin ratio. So contribution margin ratio, in other words, is contribution per unit all over the selling price per unit, or the unit contribution over unit selling price. That's CMR. So whatever you get in that regard, use it as a denominator to divide fixed cost. Then the result will be BEP in Naira. So in a nutshell, what we meant is fixed cost all over contribution per unit all over unit selling price or selling price per unit. Or a very simple way to go about it is whenever you've gotten your contribution, your BEP in unit, whatever you get as your BEP in unit, just multiply it by the selling price per unit. It's the same thing as BEP expressed in sales value. Going back to our illustration, we got in our previous lecture series and presentation slide that our BEP in unit is 25,000 units. Now, if the question wants us to express that BEP in Naira, what we need to do is take that 25,000 Naira, just multiply it directly by the selling price per unit. So, we don't need to go through the stress of fixed cost over CMR. So, it will just be a continuation. Most of the time, the structure of the question is always that question 1, compute BEP in unit. Question 2, compute BEP in Naira. So, you wouldn't need to disturb yourself. What you just do is that you just pick the reference which you have done in question 1 above, which is BEP in unit. Just multiply it by the unit selling price or the selling price per unit, and that will be your BEP in Naira. So, from our previous question, definitely our BEP in units in Naira will then be 25,000 units multiplied by 9 naira. I believe you are following me. 25,000 units multiplied by 9 naira. Don't forget that 9 naira is our unit selling price, while 25,000 units is our BEP in units. So that will give us 225,000 naira expressed in Nigerian denomination. So this is what we refer to as break-even point in naira or in monetary value, or break-even point expressed in sales value. So apart from this, another method in which the examiner could test you as the examinee or the student is for the examiner to ask you that which level of sales, which amount of sales will give us a targeted level of profit. Don't forget, we said that at BEP, there is no loss, there is no profit. So there's nothing like profit in BEP. But when the question wants you to compute the level of sales that will result in a specified profit or a specific targeted profit, then the formula changes. The formula then becomes as against fixed cost over contribution per unit. The formula will change and become fixed cost plus target profit. The addition of these two, the summation of these two, the total of these two forms our numerator. As against fixed cost initially being the only numerator. So we say fixed cost plus target profit. Summate the two. That's the numerator. Then divide it by the contribution per unit. Then that will give us the level of sales to result in a particular target profit. So in other words, level of sales to result in target profit, which is expressed in units, is equal to fixed cost plus target profit altogether divided by contribution per unit. Now, let's take our existing illustration. Let's assume that XYZ Nigeria Limited, all other variables and information are constant. In addition, XYZ Nigeria Limited proposes to make a profit of 20,000 naira. Proposes to make a profit of 20,000 naira. The question is, compute the level of sales that will result in this targeted profit. In other words, what's the level of sales that would make XYZ Nigeria Limited to be able to make 20,000 naira profit after recouping its fixed cost and its variable cost? Then this is very simple. All other factors are the same. Fixed cost is still 100,000 naira. Variable cost is still 5 naira. Selling price is still 9 naira. So, how do we go? We have a targeted profit of how much? 20,000 naira. So, what level of sales will make XYZ Nigeria Limited to make this profit? So, XYZ Nigeria Limited needs to make so level of unit of sales. How do we get this unit of sales? What you need to do is to say the fixed cost plus the target profit. The fixed cost 100,000 naira plus target profit of 20,000 naira. When you add this together, we have 120,000 naira as the numerator. So you write this down. That's step 1. Step 2. We already know our contribution per unit, and how do we get that? 9 naira minus 5 naira. We get 4 naira. So that's our contribution per unit. Step 2. Step 3. Take the summation of the fixed cost and target profit, which is 100,000 plus 20,000, which equals 120,000. Divide it by the contribution per unit of 4 naira per unit. So, now, when we divide 120,000 naira by 4 naira, class, what is it going to give us? I know you are echoing it there, 30,000 units. So, for XYZ Nigeria Limited to make a profit up to the tune of 20,000 naira, then it needs to to make a sale up to the level or to the tune of 30,000 units. Now, what's the rationale, or what's the hint or tips behind this? Now, don't forget that we say that at 25,000 units, our level of profit or loss is 0. No profit, no loss. Don't forget I said that any unit sold below this will result in a loss, and every unit sold above this will result in a profit. Now listen, up to the tune of 4 naira per unit, the contribution margin. So any one unit sold below this will result to a loss up to the tune of 4 naira, the contribution margin per that unit. While any unit sold above this 25,000 units will result in a profit of 4 naira per the unit exceeded. So now, when we look at the difference between 25,000 units and 30,000 units, that's what? 5,000 units. When you multiply that by the contribution margin or contribution per unit of 4 naira, will result in our target profit of 20,000 naira. So that's just the axiom, that's the rationale, that's the logic behind the formula of BEP or CVPA. Now, before we wind up the class, and before we have a very short quiz in the class, or in our subsequent videos, be able to look at this quiz. But before concluding the class, I'd like to also enlighten us on how level of sales that result in targeted profits could be expressed in naira. You know, how we express BP in units and in naira. So also we want to express this in naira or in sales value. Sales value. According to what I said, there's nothing special about expressing in naira or in sales value, in as much you are first expressed in units. Whatever you get in units, just multiply it by the unit selling price or the selling price per unit. It's the same thing as expressing whatever you are told to express in naira on sales value. So, since we get our level of sales that will result in 20,000 naira target profit to be 30,000 units, then expressing that in naira, that's going to be 30,000 units multiplied by the selling price, and the selling price is what? 9 naira. So 30,000 units multiplied by 9 naira, that's 270,000 naira. This is the level of sales that will result in targeted profit expressed in naira. Thank you for coming to this extent in this class. Then watch out for our next video, which will be a winding up session on CVPA, in which the series will actually be talking on margin of safety. After which, we'll look at another lecture series another lecture episode on marginal costing and absorption costing.